Bliss and Grit is an entirely listener-supported show. Supporting us is also designed to support you through keeping the episodes rolling, but also through rewards for your donation, like a getting started guide, a private forum, and downloadable meditations. To become a supporting member, you can visit patreon.com/bliss and grit.
Hello, beautifuls. You are listening to Bliss and Grit. I'm Vanessa Scotto, and I'll be joined soon by my dear friend and my co-host, Brooke Thomas. On the show, we're having conversations about what we could call the awakening spiritual path. What does that even mean? What is a real evolution of our lives? How do we ultimately embrace everything? The beauty and the crazy, the joys and the messes, the bliss and the grit that is a human life. Today, we're speaking with our special guest, Jane Clapp. Jane's a departure from our typical guest who speaks on awakening. She's a mindful strength and movement coach, a trauma-informed embodied resilience expert, and a Jungian analyst in training. We love all that she has to say about trauma-informed mindfulness and nervous system regulation interventions. Actually, Brooke took a class with her called From Fawn to Fierce that she really appreciated, and we thought the topic of moving from fawn to fierce was perfect for all of us. So we invited her on the show, and we are so glad that we did. We had a lot of fun with this interview, and we're sure you will too. Jane sees clients one-on-one and has an online movement for trauma program coming in January. That sounds excellent. So for more information on Jane, go to www.janeclapp, and that has 2 P's, janeclapp.com. Thank you for being here as a listener. We hugely appreciate it. If you want to stay up to date on all things Bliss and Grit and get a weekly digest of resources we're currently loving, you can go to blissandgrit.com to subscribe. And if you're wanting more in-depth support as you navigate your own internal process, we both also see clients privately, so feel free to go to the website for more information on that. One last thing before we head into conversation, we do sometimes curse, and I do believe we did in this episode. So if you're in non-swearing company, you may want to wear some headphones. Okay, everyone, here we go.
So hello, Vanessa, and hi,
Hello.
Jane.
Hi.
It is so nice to have you joining us as our guest this week.
I was so excited you asked me.
So
you
fun.
guys are the coolest.
Oh, thank you.
Stop.
This is going to be, like a idealized girlfriend, love fest, sleepover party type episode.
I'm going to project all these ideas about who you are onto you.
Oh, yeah. Well, they're all true as long as they're good. Just kidding. Well, and we're also talking about a subject that I think is near and dear to all 3 of our hearts. So I'd imagine this will also be extra fun playtime in that way too. If you're nerdy about the things that we're nerdy about, I guess that is. So that being that Vanessa and I recently have talked a lot more and more on the show about the fawn trauma response and sort of the fawn trauma persona that can develop out of that response becoming habitual. And recently I took your webinar, which you titled From Fawn to Fierce.
Do you feel fierce now?
I do. It was very helpful. And I just love the title. I just like saying it. Fawn to Fierce is so perfectly worded. So your webinar, for those who are not familiar, was specifically to entrepreneurs. So it wasn't a trauma recovery webinar. It was for people who make things in the world in a self-employed or entrepreneurial way, which isn't what we talk about here on the show, but the 3 of us are all pretty honed in on this topic outside of the entrepreneurial space as well. So just to start, why don't we start a little bit with terminology instead of just throwing around fawn trauma response? What is the fawn trauma response? How does it present?
Well, it first was named as a survival response based on some science that came out about 20 years ago, named as Tendon, Befriend. And over the last few years, I think Pete Walker was pretty responsible for using the term fawn. Tendon, Befriend is a very natural survival response that has been shown for people who have more dominant female sex hormones, that when we actually move into a state of caring about other people and tending to their needs, we actually increase social bonds. And in that increase in social bonds, we release oxytocin, which helps mediate the effects of stress hormones and helps us feel safer. So it's a very natural and very common survival response to help people feel more connected, more in community with other people. As a trauma response, this is where it gets really tricky, because if it's a typical survival response that isn't necessarily related to trauma, when does it become a traumatic response? What is the tipping point in making it more of a response to trauma versus just a social behavior that is really naturally, inspired by our biology? And what I find for me, especially as I dig deeper into training in Jungian analysis and doing my own, is that so much of it has to do with when the tendon befriend response becomes really dominant in terms of a survival response, it inhibits the process of individuation. It stops us from really claiming our true self with a capital S. It blocks us from really connecting with our soul, with our life purpose, and it starts to crowd out kind of a sense of who we really are in the world. Mm-hmm. And so it can become, it's not just in response to relational trauma. It can also be something that we could trace back for decades and decades, what has been socialized into women. I'm going to say women. I don't want to be binary, but there is a reality to the way that women have been socialized, especially after the Second World War. In terms of our value has come in from tending and befriending, right? Mm-hmm. And so it's not just a trauma response, but it can show up as a trauma response relationally for sure. But how do we trace where it comes from? Does it come from individual relationships, or is it something that we're socialized into? And how do we unpack that? And how do we start finding other ways to feel strong and safe in the world that don't require us to negate or hide who we really are, and allow us to break away from the pack if that is what is ultimately important for the survival of our soul.
Mm-hmm. That was beautifully said, Jane. Thank you. I love that. And I love differentiating between a survival response and a trauma response. And when I think about it, another word they use for it is placate. And I think that reflects a little bit about what you're saying about how it can turn into this sort of dominant way of engaging where at the expense of ourselves, we may placate another person because somewhere in the background, in the unconscious, we think that will make us safer or more loved or more respected.
Or it has made us safer.
For sure. Mm-hmm. And that's really what I saw growing up. When I trace back, I would say all of those things you just said. I would say I saw it in my mother. I would say I saw it in the culture. I would say I got rewarded for it, right? Oh, you're a nice person. You're a good person. All of those things that were happening culturally. And I would say I had a very aggressive, violent father, and placating worked best.
Mm-hmm. It was effective.
Very, very effective. And then, of course, like with everything over time, as you mature and evolve and you get out of those same circumstances, you come to see that these things have become habitual and they have become patterned, and that your identity has gotten woven into it, and your sense of what a good person is or a sense of self has gotten woven into it. So that's just to give some background, but I'm curious when you're working with somebody and you can see like, okay, it comes from my mom, comes from society, comes from my personal trauma history. How do you begin to unpack that with a person so that they can move into this new way of engaging that's not based on self-sacrifice?
Oh, wow. It's funny. I just got off a call, sorry, with someone. And I get a lot of people who are like, I want to get this trauma out of my body, right? Mm-hmm. I want to release this. I want to help my body discharge this. Blah, blah. I'm like, okay, so what is this? So my first question is like, okay, well, what is this? Like, what is the discomfort that you're describing? Some people have learned that their posture is a reflection of the fawn response, right? Kind of submit, play small. Inevitably, I'm like, well, we can go in through on an emotional level, but it's not going to undo the impact that it's had on your myofascial system. So oftentimes the entry point is, well, how do we build up your dignity muscles?
Interesting.
Sometimes I'll just go in through the physical and help people see and feel through embodied evidence that they have a structure that is there to hold them up if they just call upon it. I was like, you don't need new muscles. You just need to bring the ones that you have online. So even like coming in through the dignity sling, right, in the upper back, over the shoulders, and helping people start feeling muscular slings in their body can help them start to be like, oh, I do have strength that's available to me, that I just have to make a really conscious effort to feel and connect with. So,
and how would you describe what the dignity sling is? Because I can feel all of our listeners going, tell me what the dignity sling muscles are.
I want it. Dignify me.
Well, my training, right, exactly. My training was in strength and conditioning for many years. And so there's people that really have influenced my work. I think a big part of that was really assessing the posterior chain. So the superficial back line has a huge impact in terms of helping people feel more dignity. Charles Poliquin, I don't know if either of you heard of him. He passed last year. He has such a focus on basically how can we help your stabilizing muscles and your deeper structural muscles support your big muscles. It's basic. So it would be, how can we strengthen your rhomboids? How can we strengthen your posterior deltoids? How can we help you feel your serratus and how that wraps around into the front of your body when you, like, it's basically a very safe entry point for a lot of people is one of the most basic, easy to translate exercises, which is what I call the wall angel. Do you both know the wall angel?
Mm-hmm. This where you line up and you...
Yeah, but oftentimes people can't really lift their arms up very high. And so that is a really great entry point because my work is really like, what can you do when you're by yourself? What can you do when you're not with your therapist? Because a lot of folks I see are also seeing a therapist or psychiatrist. What can you resource yourself with to remind yourself of the strength that your body inherently carries, and really attempting not to be ableist about it. But I do think like a lot of people have lost conscious awareness with the strength that their body inherently carries with them, with the resiliency that their body carries. So that's a great place to start. Most folks are really tight across their arm fascial line, right?
Yeah.
And so how do we start working there? But there's some really simple exercises once people feel connected and safe with me that we can start doing. Like there's a stake your space exercise. There's some boundary work pushing against a wall that can be really helpful for people. But excuse me. Damn, I'm gonna cough.
That's okay. Coughing happens.
I know. I had a flu a couple weeks ago, and And a very fun visit with my parents on top of that. So
compounding goodness.
Yeah, very good. Very good. So I think the most basic access point for folks, as I mentioned, was how can you just feel what's already there? And yeah, so any questions about kind of dignity muscles?
No, I think it's helpful to spell out what those are, because I'm sure people are going to want to know. And I love that you're discussing taking, like, as a first route, this somatic experiential route, have an experience of what it feels like to inhabit dignity, really.
I learned a lot. I specialized in working with women before cancer diagnosis, during cancer treatment, and post-treatment, especially for women who went through breast cancer treatment, women who had mastectomies, lumpectomies, and reclaiming ownership of their body again, relating to their body in a way that's really based on dignity, possibility, and strength was such a huge element of what informed me about strength in people's bodies, especially after facing a threat to life, which is what people, when they experience really intense relational trauma, it really feels like. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of that kind of reclaiming dignity again in people, in your body, especially when you have the actual fascial impact of breast cancer surgery, really was such a learning ground for me that informed a lot of my work today, and preparing people's bodies for mastectomies or lumpectomies, and preparing them for having to give up control of their body, and surrender to the treatment of surgeons or oncologists, and then come back into a place of dignity and strength again, was really, really powerful, and really brought a lot of empirical research into my lap. Nobody felt safe at the time working with folks during cancer treatment, because Health Canada had like no exercise guidelines for people, and insurance wouldn't have covered my work with them, and they just started kind of coming through my door. So that was really powerful. But in terms of the Fawn response on an emotional level, we go there because we don't have other resources available to keep us safe. We do that because it's the most adaptive. It's also a way that we, in relationship, get our needs met. Mm-hmm. So when I think about the way I grew up, if I didn't submit and I didn't pretend that I thought, for example, my father was amazing, I didn't get any attachment, right? I would be frozen out or be under greater threat. So I fawned for my life, right? And it's taken me, I'm like, 46? It's taken me until now to feel safe not doing that. But what it required wasn't just different way of thinking or feeling. It required me getting structures in my life and feeling able to take care of myself enough that the hardest Fawn relationship I had in my life didn't need to exist anymore. And so I graduated a couple weeks ago. I graduated because I was able to be in front of someone who I go into habitual Fawn, and I maintain my dignity, right?
Happy graduation to you.
Yeah.
It was, right?
It's huge to have that experience. Huge.
I think we underestimate when we're young and naive what the healing process really looks like. And I'm 45, and only over this last 6 months feel like I've really been coming to the other side of codependency. And of course, there's been a gradual evolution, but I mean, really getting free of acting just from that habitual pattern, because it's so deep. My identity was wound up in it, my safety. And like you were saying, what's been clear to Brooke and I is that the way what you could call conditioning affects us, it's mental, it's energetic, it's physical, it's psychological, it's I don't know if it's spiritual. I don't know if that's the right way to say it, but it's on all of these different levels. I love when you talk about dignity in the body because it's such a lovely, relatable word. And I think when I was young, one of the things I noticed was you guys will know better. Is it lordosis when your belly sticks out and your back kind of? Okay. So I had this hyperlordosis of my back, and I've always been aware that my core muscles were weak. And I'd have sweet people try to train me on them, and I had no desire to. In fact, I could feel like a no, like an internal no. And I, at some point, got aware enough to say, oh, I think there's a correlation here, right? Like there's a correlation with the psychology. So Brooke and I usually talk on the show about the psychological level where you can intervene or the awakening level where you can intervene. But I love bringing in that there are somatic levels at which you can intervene and begin to recognize who you really are and what you're really capable of in such a tangible way.
Well, I would say my spirituality is very sensate. So my spirituality comes through my senses. I ride horses. I ride one horse in particular. And when I'm putting myself in this position where I have to jump over something, which is only like, 2 feet high, but it's scary as fuck, right? Because when you jump, and I don't know if you've done this, but my butt's out of the saddle. I'm hanging on to nothing. Like my hands aren't hanging on to anything. I might grab a piece of mane, but that doesn't always help. My heels and maybe my lower leg is keeping me on this horse. And I have to get into this state of like complete fierce and calm at the same time. And all that it's so much about like dignity and having this horse be like, okay, I'm going to listen to you. And then there's this moment of when you jump, you have to kind of put your hands forward and release. You have to surrender. But leading up to that really hard moment, I have to be in this we'll bring in the warrior archetype or Xena warrior princess is sometimes who I stand on.
That show. Oh my
right? God. So I'm like, what would Xena do? And so, but I have to be so grounded at the same time. And when I think of fierce, that's what it means to me. Fierce doesn't mean violence. And I think a lot of people who have experienced violence, emotional or physical violence, associate fierce with either unconsciously or consciously with violence, that somehow there's something oppressive or aggressive about that fierceness. And it's not for me. So when I think about coming in through the body to access the spirit, I'm like, well, our spirit lives in our body, right? It's a part of us. And what better way to come in if we felt so disconnected or disempowered in our body to light our spirit up through our body? Like, how can we bring our libido, our prana, our chi, all of that back online, but to literally use the gifts that we've been given in our tissues to say, you are here. I've always been here. I never left you. You know?
I love that. And you were talking about how those who have experienced fawn as a way to survive or be safe, that we can often not want to identify with fierce because we might associate that with violence in the other, the one who caused harm. And then something else that I see sometimes in this recovery process from the fawn persona or the fawn habit is that we can believe that the good ones, right, are the self-sacrificial ones. And this is where fawn and codependency, I think, get very, very close. That if we're self-sacrificing, then we're the good ones. And there can be an aversion to stepping into your power in simple ways, right? Just like what you would like to do for your day or your career can feel like it's a bad idea or a negative value to take your attention off of caretaking and put your attention on well, what do I want? And I'm wondering if you've encountered that, you know, in yourself or with clients, and if you find that there's a way to speak to that for people, or if you find that people just at a certain point have to be motivated to say, enough, you know, I want some of my power back. It's not a bad value to have.
Well, it's uncomfortable to have to change, first of all. So if the fawn response isn't more painful from being disconnected from ourselves, we aren't going to change. Like the pain of the disconnection, and sometimes we need outer events to force us into that state, like of actual hitting rock bottom. And I have a very distinct memory of my own rock bottom that was, it was sort of like, if I don't find some strength in me now, it could all fall apart. There was that very, very, very shaky ground of like, what am I going to do here? And it was really, really scary. And that I think for folks that we don't change because we feel good. We don't all of a sudden get out of fawn because we feel calm. Like we need to be disrupted a lot of the time to change, either internally or externally. And some of the things that happen when the fawn response stops being beneficial is we experience somatic symptoms. We experience the ways that our unconscious mind is trying to wake us up to get us back into who we are. Because it's sort of like the idea, an oak tree is always an oak tree. And when you try not to be an oak tree and you try to be something else, there's a huge amount of suffering that is involved. And it used to be called neuroses. I spent the whole weekend comparing Freud, Adler, Jung, and Karen Horney's theory. And she was one of the only feminist psychoanalysts from the 20th century, I think. The mid 20th century at the time.
Bold of her. That must have been a no fun boys club.
Yeah, right. and it used to be called neuroses, right? And or hysteria. But when I think of anxiety as the new catch-all phrase for a lot of mental health suffering that we're experiencing, I think in some ways we try to regulate it away. Yeah. So lots of folks are into nervous system regulation. Lots of folks are about, well, how can I discharge the stress? How can I regulate my nervous system? But we need a critical buildup of tension in order to mobilize ourselves to move forward. And so sometimes that comes up in ways in somatic symptoms that we actually have to resolve. But the more we try to make ourselves like calm and comfortable when our body is screaming at us, the more I think we lose the potential motivation to move forward. And there's a lot of that, like there's a lot of cost to the self that has to happen for people to move out of fawn.
That's interesting. Brooke and I had done a class a while back. We were students in a class, and it was a kind of nervous system regulation type of class. And what was interesting was at the end of the time, there were some people who felt amazing. And Brooke and I were dissociated,
nauseous, vertigo.
Nauseous. Yeah, our blood pressure had dropped through the floor.
Yeah.
And at the time, we couldn't quite understand it. We were just beginning to learn polyvagal theory, and we were saying, what's happening? Like, we could see other people were feeling amazing, but maybe it was about 20% of the class, or 25 was more feeling what Brooke and I were feeling. And over time, you know, what's come to me is, okay, it seems as if there was something where perhaps the other people were in fight or flight. And when they experienced all of these types of calming techniques, they said, I feel so good. I feel so balanced. Whereas we seem to go right into that, dorsal vagal, right? That's that part. The immobilization. Right into dorsal vagal and right into freeze. And we had a completely horrific dissociative experience. And that was some of the information we had over, wow, to treat freeze or to treat something like what, you know, we're calling fawn or placate, requires a different intervention. So even just you saying like, hey, if you try to regulate away some of that energy that might be building to get you to address some of the deeper issues in your life, that's interesting.
And, I don't know if fawn is actually a hypoarousal response. Mm-hmm. I'm not so clear on that. I don't actually know that fawn is a dorsal vagal response. When I think of submit and play dead, like a lizard, right? You go into, I call it low activation freeze. There's low activation freeze and high activation freeze. First of all, that's in the way that I teach. If we think of fawn, there's a nervousness attached to it. There's anxiety attached to it. So I'm not so sure it is lacking in activation.
That makes perfect sense. Have you ever noticed, because, I had been a habitual fawner. Have you ever noticed that people who tend towards fawn as a response, and I had plenty of fight in my life, but fawn was just the more predominant one, also tend towards freeze? Because that was just something that I seen, like if you look at people and how they're sort of wired, that they might be dissociative and then they might also move towards fawn. Or do you not see it like that? Like, do you see a whole variety?
Well, I think fawn is quite active, right? It's active, unlike a low activation freeze, which is submit. But what I think of when I think of Stockholm syndrome, right? I think of that. Some people put that on the hypoarousal level, but what we do as a last resort, oftentimes, say under extreme threat to life, we could go into fawn before we realize that didn't work as a last line of defense. And then we can go into complete, submit or play dead or feign death is the term. So I'm not so sure, because what I've noticed, that I just finished Embodied Boundaries for Empaths webinar today. And one of the things I try to prepare folks for is when they stop going into tending and befriending, that they're going to have a shit ton of anxiety left over.
Yes.
That actually it's so anxiety soothing to go into fun, as what I've tracked in myself over the years. So when I've had to pull back on my behavior and set an internal boundary for myself, which is definitely in the language of codependency. And I did a lot of work with a group around codependency myself. After I hit rock bottom, I prepare people. I'm like, we think about when we're setting boundaries as getting a lot of flack coming at us. And Melody Beattie talks a lot about the flack we get. But when we stop going into tending and befriending and fawning as a way to feel safe, we have this big surge of anxiety left over from not engaging in the behavior. And so we have to prepare for this internal flack of get ready for it, because now you're not doing the thing that's alleviating your anxiety. So I'm not so sure that fawn is hypoarousal, because it's active and it dissipates anxiety.
Interesting. I've noticed that anxiety come up when I don't engage in that tend and befriend. Right? I know exactly what you mean. Then it has tipped to guilt and shame, but it had that vibration of anxiety, of fear, that you're describing. I just never saw it through that lens as being anxiety soothing. I always saw it as, well, if the system was set up that safety was found this way and you don't do this, it's almost like the system sets off the alarm bells, like, no,
not
do
safe
that
now.
thing. And because I always experienced it as guilt. So I was always looking at it through the more, let's say, psychological lens, because that's really my background. But it's really interesting to chew on and to see, I love what you're describing. Brooke and I are the same. We always think of ourselves as field reporters. Like you just have to get in there and experientially learn and then come back and you report, like, this is how it feels to me. What does it feel like to you? What's working for you? And I love that you're bringing that in as well.
The other thing that comes up is, did you see the research from a couple of years ago that tracked social pain and social exclusion as being tied to the same brain center in the brain as physical pain? So when we think of pulling back on tending and befriending or even fun, and we risk being rejected or socially excluded, when we've learned that we actually get some form of attachment and acceptance by going into that fun, people-pleasing state, let's say, and then we decide that we're going to change and not do that, what can really happen is it can signal this alarm system in our body that says, oh, we're actually choosing social exclusion, or we're choosing not to attach or try to connect with this person because they're not safe for us. It can leave people feeling really confused about, their head is saying that they want this thing, they want to feel stronger, they want to feel more powerful, and yet their body is freaking out, kind of like, what's going on here? And so people, the kind of memes around the body never lies. I'm like, yeah, it does sometimes. Sometimes the body is just kind of telling us that the past is still present, but it's not.
Yeah, I think often it is. And it feels like, what you're describing is basically that it would feel like to the person choosing harm. I'm going to go ahead and choose harm, by choosing not to engage in fawn. And I have, see if I can find it in my little notes here, because in the webinar that I did with you, From Fawn to Fierce, you talked about part of your recovery from this being, taking your attention off of other people as a recovery strategy. And you said is hard work. And certainly I have found that in myself. Certainly I've found it in my clients. Vanessa and I have trained in something called the realization process, which is Judith Blackstone's work. And it's a lot of embodiment work that can go in a myriad of different ways. But one of the ones that I personally love and do with clients a lot is, can you engage in the world and in life from inside of your own body? And somebody who has a fawn or a codependent pattern is almost never inside their own body. Most of us are never inside our own body, but fawn will be always scanning the room, always scanning the others, always predicting their emotions, always coming up with a plan to please and appease. And so this act of learning how to take attention off of others feels so vulnerable. It sounds silly to somebody who hasn't experienced this pattern maybe, but it feels so vulnerable and like you're setting yourself up for harm in a certain way. And I just wonder, is there any way to help people prepare for that hard work? Maybe we've covered it already with just saying there will be fear, there will be anxiety that's left over in preparing people.
I love John Kabat-Zinn's teaching around staying on your board. So I suggest that people prepare ahead of time for the discomfort. So be able to predict it, be able to see it coming, be able to have a plan for how you're going to stay on your surfboard so you don't fall into the discomfort. Because, in terms of being in the body, for me, the language I would use is interoception. Right? And so there's only a certain amount that people who've lived with trauma can access interoception without feeling overwhelmed by it. And I use a really simple image in my teaching where it's a picture of a woman jumping into water and not having any access to oxygen. So the body is like fully immersed in water and there's no access to oxygen. So what that means to me is there's no dual awareness available. I'm sure you two have heard that term, right?
I'm not really familiar with it. Like, I get it, but I don't know it that way. No.
So when I think about, first of all, I think for me, I have a high level of interoception, of sensate awareness, of feeling, and not a lot of folks have that in the same way that I do. So when I think about encouraging people to be in their body, I try to understand it from, if you don't mind me saying, from an ableist lens. Of understanding that interoception is not something, the kind of interoception I have available in terms of being in my body is not what is available to everybody. And we're all wired a little differently. Some people are more thinking types. Some people are more feeling types. Some people are more sensate types. So we need to understand that the way we prepare people has to be based on really who they are, first of all, versus people who can really connect with interoception in a way that's resourcing. So when I think of that, I always think about if people are going to start dipping into interoception coming back to their own body awareness. How can people have one foot on the ground and one foot in the water? And when that's kind of how I teach dual awareness. So it could be through exteroception, through external senses, because some people connect with their bodies through their senses more than they do interoceptively. So I'm always like, or proprioception and interoception, exteroception and interoception, equilibrioception, which is the sense of balance, and interoception. And how can people prepare? And this is how I help people stay on their boards when they're trying to do something really hard, when they could have a huge rush of discomfort or anxiety or fear come into their bodies. So preparing a tool in advance that works for that individual so that they can use it when they do the change in the behavior or they stop themselves from doing something, right? Mm-hmm. And then go to the tool that helps them stay on their board is really, really important. Mm-hmm. So, yeah.
Can I ask a clarifying question? Okay, I want to make sure I got dual awareness. So when you said the words, what my immediate assumption was, and so I want to make sure I actually got myself there, was being aware of myself and others at the same time, or my internal reality and the external reality. Okay.
That
great.
could be too.
That could be too. Okay, great. So when you talked about helping people find a tool so that they can have this dual awareness, because I think what I'm getting is you're saying a lot of times people can't have that dual awareness. It's either other-centered, maybe for some people it's completely internal. I don't know those people exactly. I work with a lot of empaths. It's usually very other-centered.
Internally centered folks could be people who have a lot of medical fears, health fears, chronic pain. Stuff. Chronic pain. Yeah. And they're looking for danger inside their body.
Yeah.
I have done that. Okay,
yeah,
great.
I'm like, grew up that way. Yes. Got it. That map got really well developed.
Yeah, Brooke and I talked about this a while back. I think Judith Blackstone actually did some work with me, and I saw it, that there was a hypervigilance to my internal body, which I kind of always had, but it exploded after I got a health crisis, where it was like, it's like you're checking for your wallet every second. Like, is it there? Is it there? So as well as a hypervigilance externally. So that kind of makes a person crazy. But however, feeling great now. So, and then if I heard you right, what you're saying is you track the type of language that they most fluently speak, whether it be kinesthetic, like a somatic language, or a feeling-based one, or a thinking-based one. Mm-hmm. And then once you understand that, you help them find a tool that works for them, that is a resourcing tool. For when inevitably all of these intense emotions might come up. Is that right?
And to help them stay with themselves. So in terms of the way I'm using dual awareness is what I use in my Movement for Trauma program, which is really based on how can I help this person stay embodied. A lot of folks determine embodiment solely based on interoception. But I don't look at it that way, because I work with a diverse population, first of all. And there's a lot of folks who I work with who've had a history of eating disorders or can't spend a lot of time inside. So I want to give them a tool to maybe check in and then find another way to stay present with their bodies that doesn't involve jumping in the deep end.
Got it.
And so that can be really helpful for people to prepare themselves. Like, what helps you stay feeling resource grounded and safe in your body, particular to you? So that can be helpful. A lot of my courses, I have like different tools that people can try, because it's not a one size fits all. And Babette Rothschild came up with the term dual awareness she's a renowned trauma therapist. And so what I did is I took that term dual awareness and extrapolated it into just a way for people to stay more embodied with different perceptions. So that's kind of,
Yeah. I'm a body person. My whole work life has been about body, for 2 decades. And Vanessa and I have talked about this on the show, but I hit a particular patch in my own trauma recovery that was like, you pry the manhole cover off of Pandora's box. And it's just, and then the feeling was like, I'm stuck in here with terror, all the time. And I had to learn, like you're describing, the safety, the really nourishing safety of going to the space, you know, and acknowledging how safe the space I was in. If I'm in my room, you know, or the window, or the feeling of air on my skin. And I had to sort of retrain myself to be able to scan for the good, while that, it almost felt like a process that was metabolizing itself. It didn't require me to be shining my spotlight on it all the time. It required me, the healing, to be able to access, to feel safety and goodness, and to try to build a map to that again.
Yeah. And help your body be in the present.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that there can be these things that we hear so much. You know, for me, I'm in the field about the body. It's my deep passion and great love. And so it's like, well, the good way is build more and more and more and more somatic and interoceptive awareness. And it's like, and fortunately, you know, I got to have the experience that we just can't make these things one size fits all. We have to work with what's right in front of us.
I also wonder too, like, is deeper somatic emotional awareness an expression of a more introverted personality? And do we relate to our body based more on a more introverted kind of way of being in the world, or extroverted? And how do we work with who people really are? You know, I think that's another perspective to consider.
For sure.
One thing I think of is, okay, so I've been working with clients a long time. And when it comes to transformation and finding new ways of engaging that are more aligned, one of the things people seem to be afraid of is the feelings they'll encounter, right? The things in their body that at one time were overwhelming and so might have been repressed or contracted, or what it will cost them in their life to see something new. And then they're also afraid of what we were talking about earlier, like what will happen if they stop tending and befriending? Who will they be? What if they're fierce? Is that violent? Is that aggressive? Will they still be a good person? And you said something on your website that I was reading that I'd like to share. And we touched on this, but I'd love to go deeper. You said, in our society, we can idealize empathy, yet lose the ability to discern between the fawn, tend, and befriend, or a true empathy response. And another one of the fears that I've seen people run into, and it's honest, is they're like, am I going to be a shitty person? You know, we've all seen those people who say, I'm going to be honest. And so they like tear a hole in people with their honesty, right? Like they tip to this unhealthy extreme. So I think a lot of sensitive and empathic people who've been prone to this because it was accessible, this was an accessible response, worry, like, how do I know the difference between when I'm being selfish, since relationships do seem to involve empathy and some compromise sometimes, versus when am I really just being whole and present with what is? And so I wonder if you could just speak a little bit to that discernment between fawn and a true empathy response.
Well, I think it comes in through my work a lot, because there was a time, I'd say about 7 years ago, that I'm like, I'm so drained working with people. And I use Cartman's drama triangle sometimes. Have you seen that? It's used in to explain codependency, but you've got like the rescuer, the victim, the persecutor.
Yes.
And what I started tracking, I can use my body to tell when I'm getting out of a loving detachment state with somebody, and accepting that people have their own free will. You know, I've worked with people who are definitely have suicidal tendencies, and I've had to accept they might not come through the door again. And obviously they're well resourced with psychiatric care as well, where I just have to be like, well, they have their own free will. They have a choice. So what I find is, and I teach a lot of folks who work in the front lines with people who've survived sexual assaults and more violence against families, children, and around burnout and around compassion fatigue. So this is really real for me. What I find for me is when it's genuine empathy, when it's genuine connection, I feel very alive. I don't feel drained. When it's true, healthy caring, and I'm not going into the shadow side of being a helper, right? The shadow side of empathy is the rescuer. And the shadow side of that leaves us feeling very drained. So the way I can tell I'm in a healthy, caring situation is when I feel my spirit feels more alive. I feel connected. I can be with people who have experienced such intense trauma, and it doesn't leave me drained because I'm respecting the boundaries between us as separate people, and that I'm here to hold space. I'm here to support them, but I can't do more than that. And I think that's the big difference for me. You know that you are moving out of potentially being in a healthy, caring, connected, empathic state when you start to feel energetically drained. Mm-hmm. Would you say?
It makes perfect sense to me because I had hit a stage of burnout. I've been working with people for 20 years, and then I was like, oh my God, I'm so tired. And there's nothing I've ever wanted to do but help people, but I was getting really burnt out. And I had a year off where I took another job and came back to it. And I came back to it completely, like I'm almost never tired because of my clients. That's not a thing anymore. And I think what had happened in the interim was I had done work. We had done Judith Blackstone's program. I learned how not to move into that pattern of rescuer energetically, psychologically, like on all these different levels. And so then, turned out the problem wasn't working with humans. The problem was that I had this old habitual way of engaging that was exhausting me.
Mm-hmm. And do we define ourselves by what we do for people? How do we define who the self is? Are we defined by a role? Or are we defined by our integrity, our values, our humanness, our honesty, our ability to be present? I don't know. You know, like I get so much reward out of being with people as they change, being with people as they start to own their power. Like it's vicariously resilience building for me. And I see people who are a better resource than a lot of other people in the world. They pay for me out of pocket, right? So it's different when you're working with a population of folks who have less agency, who have less privilege, who, you know, it's inherently can be more draining. But ultimately, I think when we're in a more collaborative relationship, you know, whether that's professional or personal, we can stay in a more grounded state of just showing up and seeing that person as an individual. I did years of psychotherapy with a Buddhist psychotherapist, which really was foundational for me. So that's kind of stayed with me. So,
So in your webinar, Jane, you said something, one of many things that was very attention getting to me, that if you stayed stuck in Fawn, that you wouldn't be expressing what and who you truly are in this world.
No.
And I think this is one of the things that can really touch the heart of somebody who wants to recover from this pattern, right? That there's this heart calling, I don't want to miss out on this gorgeous life I've been given, that I would be hiding and playing small for so long that I never got to express who and what I truly am in this world. And that can be a real call for people, I think. So if we could, do you have any, stories of people who really have taken up that call so that people can get a feel for how that might look?
Yeah, I think when we think of all the nice to haves in life, I would like to feel this way, or I'd like to feel this way. We need something really imperative, right? We need the thing. We need the pull. And I think about purpose as being so deeply tied to what can pull people out of fun. Because in our purpose, in our life purpose, our soul really lives there. Our spirit really lives there. And I've been working with someone for several years, and They were a professional. Try to really be careful not to reveal who they are. Very professional in what they do. Was working in a very patriarchal industry, and slowly started coming back to life, a little bit interceptively at a time, but actually went through a full hero's journey in some ways. I've been kind of playing with the hero's journey, looking at it from what a lot of people go through when they come out of Fawn. And I think it's a beautiful graphic. So they went through they decided they're going to carve out a piece in their industry. There was an unmet need, and they needed to make sure that women had a voice in their industry. So they went through so much struggle, almost, losing their status within their organization, stuck with it, to the point that they were able to connect with this sense of purpose that was such a driver for them, that they stuck with it long enough that now they got recognition within their organization for being one of the top performers, and has created such a sense of safety out in the world. So what wasn't predictable about this was the profile that they're receiving for really speaking their truth, filling an unmet need that they felt was so imperative for women's empowerment and strength out in the world, that now they have different levels of security because they have connections with people outside of their organization and have created so many more opportunities that it's sort of like, I think of what happens when people move from Fawn to Fierce is you might lose a group. You might lose a group that you felt safer in. But as you move out of that group, there's this liminal space where you're like, what the fuck? Like, where am I? Who are my friends? Who are my people? And then you get to this phase where you're like, you meet your next people. You meet the people who support you in being strong, who value you being strong, and you reach a whole different level of security. Not because you get it from outside only, but you get it from this sense of, I have my back. It's like, I have my own back, and now I have other people who have my back too, but now I have my back. It's this feeling that is so, so beautiful to witness in people. And it's hard. It's hard work.
I know it's mind-boggling when you have the realization that what you thought was safety, because at a certain point in time it was, but what you were still thinking was safety is actually not the safest place you can be, but that rather when you come home to yourself and you live from there, safety is found in ways you couldn't even imagine before. When Brooke and I did this training with Judith Blackstone, and I landed in my body in this way that felt like I'd never been in my body before, it was like, this is safety. This is safety. And then what you're describing is, and then when someone's moving from a place that's so true to them, they're beginning to establish new things in reality that create a genuine sense of I belong, and a genuine sense of I'm safe here. I'm safe to exist as I am, at least. So it's amazing because when you're in the survival response, it kind of blocks out all of these different future possibilities, and all you might be able to access is the sense of loss. If you were to act differently, like the friend group you may lose, or the relationship you may lose, and you can't see the birth of the new so well. You know, you can only see the dying of the old and not the birth of the new. But I guess the beautiful part is we have stories, and all of us are here saying that to a great degree, we're in a new place than we were. And I would say so far, shedding codependency, which has been my most deeply ingrained pattern of my life, it is the pattern that I have looked at over and over again. And I was so scared to shed it. Scared of conflict, scared of what it would mean, that kind of stuff. And shedding it has been utterly relieving because of what you're saying. There's something inexplicable about finding your own sense of agency, something profoundly wonderful about living from there, that all of those things you were afraid of kind of pale in comparison to the joy of reuniting with yourself and living from that capital S self.
And my biggest why, I think we need a so that. I'm doing this so that I'm doing this because, like, we don't change unless we have a so that. We don't go through suffering. We don't go through that icky liminal space unless we have a really strong purpose. And my biggest so that is my soon to be 16-year-old daughter. And I want her to be able to take care of herself. I want her to connect with people because she wants to. I want her, and she helped organize the climate strike at her school. And then lo and behold, she was in a 3-hour blockade on one of the biggest streets in Toronto, sitting up against a police car. And I'm like, okay, good job. Teaching her how to manage money, like all those practical things that allow us to feel safe in the world, not in isolation. Feeling fierce has nothing to do with being in isolation. It means being able to choose who you want to be connected to, not just out of need, but out of want, out of desire. And I think we need the thing, and she was my thing. Like, I wouldn't be who I am today if she didn't need me to show up. So, yeah.
I agree. When we did DNRS, which is Dynamic Neural Retraining Systems, it was like a recovery program. I think I was also doing some consciousness work at the time, and it got clear, like, you needed a motivating factor. You had to do this work every single day, an hour a day. There was a lot to it. And the typical things, because I was working for my health, but I didn't realize I was working for something much bigger than just my physical health. The, hiking or biking, like, that all sounded nice, but it was like, that's nice. And if I lived a life where I never did it, I'd be fine. Right. Like, I'm very adaptable. That's, a gift. But in this case, like, if I never eat gluten again, like, I'm not going to fight for it. And so it was only my relationship. I saw the toll it was taking on us. Now that mattered to me. And so when I could tap into that, on those days where you're just exhausted and you don't want to do it, or that internal voice is struggling, it's what lights that flame to get you through the more challenging periods. The vision, Brooke and I have shared a quote, Reverend Michael Beckwith shares that it's pain pushes until vision pulls. And when you have that,
right? Deborah Johnson.
So, are you kidding me?
She's amazing. She's fierce. Going to see her speak is a beautiful thing.
Oh, wow. Oh, you two are amazing. I'm so grateful I could be here with you and chat with you.
This was so fun. I have a feeling we could talk for hours more.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And I am sure our listeners are going to go onto your website to find hours more worth of content and possibly some deeper ways, because, of course, we could only scratch on how someone moves from fawn to fierce here. But it's great to know that it is possible.
Mm-hmm. It is. And it's your soul's desire.
I love that.
Thank you, Jane. Thank you for all your work in the world.
Oh, thank you. So and much. See you both as well.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you so much for being a part of our community and for listening to today's show. The show notes, including any resources we mentioned, live at blissandgrit.com. That is also where you can subscribe to get our weekly digest of what we're up to and other resources that we're currently finding helpful. If you're wanting more support, blissandgrit.com also has more information on our private coaching practices. We're so grateful for the reviews you've written, for the membership support that so many of you have provided at Patreon, and for all the notes that you send. Thank you. We'll be back next week.